Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel, Chapter 18, War on the Hidden Front. Peter Jacob sat on one of the cots in the field hospital that occupied Oubliette Cathedral. It was his assignment as a reporter on the Great War. He had never been in a field hospital before, and it wasn't a pleasant sight. He wasn't sure what made it unpleasant, the fact that the wounded from the war were brought here, or the fact that Oubliette Cathedral seemed dark and forbidding for a house of God. He had to admire the nurses, or sisters, as the British soldiers called them. They did their best they could to help the soldiers, but many were beyond help. He had seen a few sisters carry soldiers out on stretchers. Every once in a while, two of the sisters would take a soldier to the old tower, where the morgue had been placed. Even now, as he glanced up from the article he was writing, he saw one sister taking a soldier away. Something about that made him stop writing. He glanced up again and watched the nurse out of the corner of his eye. This was indeed different from the other soldiers he had seen taken away. Others were taken away in stretchers, but this one was being dragged by a single nurse. The sight seemed unnatural, but seemed almost to fit with the location. The whole scene sparked his reporter's curiosity. He carefully put away his report and got up. Before he could start moving to follow the nurse, he froze as an explosion came from outside the cathedral walls. He quickly steadied himself by placing his hand on a table. When the shock wave subsided, he noticed his hand was on a letter. He picked up the letter and read it. From what he could tell, the letter was from a Private Jackson. After reading it, he learned some unsettling things. It appeared that some of the wounded disappeared at night, but it was unclear what happened to them. It just seemed odd that they left at night. The letter also said something about the place being haunted. Something about that didn't surprise him. He quickly reached into his pocket and pulled out his lucky penny. He had found the penny a few months ago. When he reached down to pick it up, it was that at that moment something happened. If he had been standing, he would have become part of a big story, instead of being the one who reported it. Thankfully, since he arrived, he didn't have any ghostly encounters. He didn't really believe in ghosts, but he didn't want to take any chances. When he was done thinking about that, he headed toward the sanctuary of the cathedral. As he headed towards it, he noticed a sister looking over some of the severely wounded soldiers. Even though he had been here a short time, he realized that most of the soldiers and sisters were British. "Excuse me, sister, but I just saw another sister taking a soldier this direction. Did you see where she went?" He watched as she shook her head and frowned slightly. "No, but maybe you should rest. The recent explosion must have shook you up." As she said that, he could have sworn he heard a strange hiss. Maybe the recent explosion did shake him up. He nodded politely at the sister. "Maybe I shall, but first I need to see where the other sister went." He continued towards the altar area, still feeling awkward. In the States, these women were called nurses, not sisters. When he reached the sanctuary, the awkwardness increased. He looked around, seeing soldiers at the stairs to below the cathedral, and one by the door to the old tower. To his left, on the far wall, all he saw was some strange red markings. However, the one thing he was expecting to see, he didn't see. The nurse dragging the body appeared to have disappeared. He had to find out where she had gone. He walked over to the soldier guarding the stairs. "Excuse me, sir, but did you happen to see a nurse bring a soldier down here?" He wasn't surprised when the soldier shook his head. He started to head over to the guard who was near the old tower door, and stopped. Sitting on the pulpit was an envelope, and on it was the same insignia that the soldiers wore. It had to be orders for one of the soldiers, a Private Thompson. He took them with him as he headed over to the old tower. He hoped that the soldier standing there was the one the orders were for. When he reached the soldier, he held up the orders and said, "Excuse me, but I think these are for you." The soldier took them and shook his head. "These aren't for me. Private Thompson is the one guarding where the soldier's personal effects are. Just head out the front door and you'll see him." "Thank you, sir." Peter quickly turned around and headed towards the front door of the massive cathedral. As he continued towards the front, he noticed the one nurse looking at him. Something about the look made him feel uneasy, and that wasn't the right feeling to get from a nurse. He started to wish he hadn't come to cover any aspect of the Great War. When he crossed into the annex of the cathedral, he saw two things. The first was the soldier he had been looking for. The other was the stairway up to the balcony. He looked at his choices again, and finally ran up the stairs. He wasn't surprised when he saw another sister at the top of the steps, and just like the others, she suggested he rest. Also, when she spoke, he heard another hiss. He was starting to wonder if this was common amongst the sisters here at Ublé Cathedral. He quickly stepped out onto the balcony, but all the time he swore he could feel her staring at him. When he reached the balcony, he quickly walked out over to the edge. Even though it was a detour from delivering the orders, Peter hoped that this new vantage point would allow him to figure out where the nurse had dragged the officer. From this viewpoint, he could see nothing different, but something told him he wasn't seeing everything. Maybe he was missing something. He even thought about taking a picture, but he had left his camera back down at the table he had found the letter. He then walked over to the door on the far side and entered the bell tower. He figured the tower would only be used for storage now, since they had silenced the bell. However, the only thing that stood out in the room was another letter. He picked it up and read it. With the more he read, he could tell there was some story here. Soldiers were missing and not discharged, and calls for help went unanswered. Peter knew he had to get to the bottom of the mystery. However, he was sure that the only way to find out more now was to get past the soldiers, and he knew how to get past one. He quickly made his way back down to the annex and rushed over to the soldier. Before the soldier could say anything, Peter held up the orders. "Private Thompson, I believe these orders are for you." He was surprised when the soldier quickly snatched the orders out of his hand. "Blimey, I was hoping these orders came in. We're finally going on the offensive. The tide of the war is changing. Thanks, lad." He then watched as the grateful soldier headed out the front door. Once in the room, he saw all the boxes that contained items for the soldiers, as well as a few corpses. Almost everything was in a crate, except for one item. That lone item was an 8mm revolver. He wondered why that was sitting out, and why the nurses saw fit to put all the items in with corpses. However, his questions stopped the second he picked up the gun. The moment he picked up the gun, there was a loud explosion, and the lights went out. Darkness quickly consumed the room, and Peter's first thought was to get out of there. The explosion had been close by, and he didn't want to be trapped in a room of corpses. However, the second he touched the doorknob, something weird happened. The room started to appear brighter, but it also seemed to change around him. It was as if Oubliette Cathedral was changing right before his eyes. Maybe this was a sign that he should get some rest, as the sisters suggested. But as screams filled the room, he was sure that wasn't going to happen. Yvette Kale wasn't surprised when Peter Jacob appeared in the surreal hallway. In fact, it had become a common sight to her since they found the Tome of Eternal Darkness in the Roivas estate. She also noticed that her husband was standing behind Peter Jacob, but he was only visible to her. She waited to speak until Peter asked the question everyone must have had on their minds. "Where am I?" "This is the resting place of the Tome of Eternal Darkness." She watched as Peter spun around and almost stumbled. She quickly grabbed his arm and held him steady. "Be careful. I don't think there is a bottom to the chasm we are over." She didn't release his arm until he motioned that he was steady. "Thank you. Are you one of the sisters from the church?" She shook her head and could see he appeared confused. "If you aren't one of them, then who are you? Do you know one of the soldiers there?" She shook her head again. "No, but I am aware of the mystery around Oubliette Cathedral. I know that it dates back for centuries." She then noticed that he was walking through the hallway, looking at each of the statues. She watched as he stood and examined the statue of Paul Luther. She watched as he looked at her while pointing at the statue. "Had this man been at the cathedral?" She nodded and wasn't surprised by the young man's next question. "Did he die there? Since it appears some of the soldiers have heard unearthly sounds there." She nodded and felt a solemn look across her face. Part of her didn't want to tell Peter about Paul's fate, but she couldn't hide the truth. He did die here, deep underneath the church, and in an unholy place. I believe that the unholy reason for his death is still in that hole." She saw the color drain from Peter's face when she said that. Before he could say another word, she raised her hand. Of all the time she had stood in this surreal hallway, she noticed that the number of statues increased, except after the chapter where her father's life had gotten intertwined with the tome. For the first time, she truly noticed that there were 7 statues and room for only one more. It was a sign, because she had a feeling who the last spot was for, and it wasn't for Peter Jacob. She looked at him and said, "However, I think you are going to be the one to stop it. I also know you won't do it alone." She watched a surprised look cross his face, but she continued, "You will have a guardian, just as I have been here to help you. Here, my husband will help you in the cathedral. I have a feeling you'll need his help, because the creatures that infest the church will try to claim you, as I'm sure they have claimed others in the church." She watched as a look of horror passed on the man's face. "The sisters, nurses, whatever they are called. I heard a hiss when I spoke with them. Do you think this force is controlling them? Is there any way to save them?" Yvette knew instantly what he was talking about. She was sure there wasn't any hope for them except death, but she didn't want to be the one to pass that news on. She glanced over toward the tome. "If there is, my husband will know. Just go get the tome, and don't be surprised if he appears to be standing next to you when you return to the cathedral." She watched as the young man nodded and ran over to the book. The second he picked it up, he started to disappear. "Thank you for the warnings, ma'am. I hope I can help those people who can still be helped." As he disappeared from sight, she noticed the hall was disappearing, and soon would be replaced by that of the secret room at the Roivas estate. As it fully came into view, she hoped that both Peter and her husband would be all right. Peter Jacob blinked twice when he realized he was back in the dark room of the cathedral. Deep down he was wondering if that whole scene had truly played out. He was still in the small room, and he was facing the door out. However, in his possession was proof that the scene did happen. He had the same book that he had grabbed in the weird hall. As he stood there thinking about all this, he heard someone clear their throat. He turned slightly and was surprised by what he saw. Standing in the dark room was a man. Judging from what he could see, the man was his age, and was dressed similarly to him. The only difference was the style, since it looked like civilian's garb. But it didn't look like anything anyone currently wore. Before he could react, the man just said, "First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving that private his orders. You had saved his life, and he's going to tell his family about it." He watched as the man walked forward to the door and opened it a crack. The man seemed to be checking the outside room, but he could have already told him that no one was out there. As the man watched, he thought about what the man had said. If this man had been hiding in here, there was no way he would have known about the orders. Then the whole scene in the strange room came back to him. He put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "I take it you must be one of that soldier's relatives, Mr. Thompson?" He watched as the man smiled at that. "You could say that. I take it my wife didn't tell you the power of the tome seems to transcend time. Both she and I are from the future of this war. Private Thompson will be my maternal grandfather." Peter felt his eyes go wide when he heard that. Something about this made him wonder how it was even possible. But then again, a British writer had come up with a story about time travel. Before he could ask another question, he saw the man hold up his hand. "We can talk this over more later. Right now, we need to find a safer place. Also, do you have any hand weapons?" Peter quickly remembered the revolver he had picked up and showed it to the man. "I just have this, but not a lot of ammo for it." He saw the other man shake his head. Something told him that the man didn't think the gun was enough, and that worried him. He then watched as the man closed the door again. As the man walked towards him again, he could tell the man had seen something that meant they weren't safe anymore. "Then there is only one course of action. We need to be invisible. Luckily, the tome has a spell that can do that. May I have the book for a moment?" Peter handed the man the book and watched as the man started to page through it. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" He was amazed when the man stopped at a page and handed the book back to him. He did a quick glance at the book, surprised that the writing was in English. The page the man had turned to was a way to reveal invisible things that were invisible. "How will that work? It says it reveals invisible things." He watched as the man pointed to some odd markings on the next page. "Normally, the spell does do that, but if you cast it with the purple rune, it will turn you invisible. I hope that if we are both invisible, we'll be able to see each other." He was about to ask what the man meant, when 5 purple marks appeared around the man. As he watched, the man appeared to fade from sight, like he was a ghost. He quickly stepped forward and reached out with his hand to see if the man had been real. He was stunned to feel his hand press against something, and heard the other man say, "Yes, I'm still here. Now I want you to cast a spell. Then we can leave this room and make our way through the cathedral." Peter did as he was told, and soon saw the same 5 runes circling him. They glowed for a moment, and the world around him took on a strange purplish haze. He also saw the man again. When the runes finally disappeared, he saw the man plain as day. "You were right, whomever you are." The man smiled and finally said his name. "Richard Cale. We can talk more once we get through to the steps in the cathedral. If I remember right, there are stairs down to a lower level right behind the altar." Peter wanted to ask how Richard knew that, but stopped when he opened the door. "Remember, silence until we get downstairs." He followed Richard out the door and was stunned at what was in the annex. There was a strange, skinny, almost skeletal creature squatting in the room. Its arms were like blades, and its head was the oddest thing. It appeared to be a reddish, skinny skull. He quickly returned his glance to Richard and followed the man into the main part of the church. When they passed through the door, he saw a nurse cowering in fear of another of the creatures. It horrified him, but the scene quickly got worse. The creature lunged and landed on her shoulders. That quickly he saw it burrow at her eyes, and soon it disappeared into her body. He glanced over at Richard and saw the man was halfway to the stairs. He started to run and glanced back at the now changed nurse. Something about the way she glanced in his direction made him worry that he had been seen. When she didn't appear to follow, he realized that she was reacting to the sound of someone running. He was thankful when they reached the steps and that no guard was there. Hopefully, the soldiers had left before the bomb struck. Before he started down the steps, he stopped to look behind him and saw on the altar a .303 military rifle. When he had walked through the church earlier, it hadn't been there. He hoped that one of the soldiers had forgotten to pick it up, instead of it being left behind by one of the wounded or dead soldiers. He quickly ran over and grabbed it, and looked quickly about the church. There were a few more of the skeletal creatures in the room. He knew he wasn't ready to tangle with them, especially when all he had was firearms. Just one blast would alert others to his location. Finally, he went down the steps behind the altar. At the bottom of the steps, he glanced down a hall to his right and saw Richard enter a door at the end of the hall. The door was on the left-hand side, and he followed Richard into it. He watched as Richard looked around the room, and by his actions, Peter realized that the man had been here before. "I take it you've been here before." As the man nodded, he said, "What exactly are you looking for?" The man picked up a box of revolver ammo and tossed it to him. "Right now, ammo for you. And maybe any clue that people knew what was happening here." As he caught the box of ammo, Peter remembered the letters he had found. He watched as the man continued looking around. "Richard, I think one of the soldiers had suspected something. I found some letters that were laying around here." He held them out for the man to look at. He watched as Richard took the offered letters and read over them. They must have nabbed them before they were sent out. Either that or they never got mailed. Frankly, anyone who is unaware of what is going on will think he's crazy. Richard handed him back the letters and then headed for the door. There are very few in the world who realize what's going on, and if one soldier managed to figure it out, then so did others. He followed Richard out of the room and into a door on the other side of the small hallway. As they looked around the room, he picked up a box of rifle ammo. "So, who all knows what is going on? Other than us?" Richard continued looking around the room. "In past and present, at least a dozen people. One important name to remember is Edward Roivas. His family has tangled with these forces in the past." Once they were done in the room, they headed out and down the hall that led from the steps. As they reached the end of the hall, Peter could see that the room contained a majority of the organ works. There was also a door opposite the organ works. He walked over to the organ works, and just from a glance he knew it wasn't working. It had been updated to the current day, and since the bombing the power was off. The only way to get the organ working would be to turn on the power. He then grabbed 2 more boxes of rifle ammo before noticing that Richard was listening to the door. He walked over to the door and quietly said, "Is there something in there?" He watched as Richard silently nodded and motioned for silence. He was stunned when the man slowly opened the door and quietly stepped inside. He understood why when he followed and saw 3 shapes moving in the darkness. Just from a glance, he could see they were roughly the size of a small dog, but their appearance made him think of a scorpion. He glanced back to see Richard slowly closing the door, and then watched as the man pointed at the creatures, and then at the revolver in his hand. He followed the motion by mimicking the action of shooting, and Peter realized what the man was saying. He quickly raised the revolver and aimed the barrel of the gun at the closest of the creatures, and fired. He was stunned at how loud the shot was, and also stunned at how quick the other creatures turned to face him. They squealed and shook their tails. He went to aim again, but Richard pushed his arm down a bit and shook his head. When the creatures stopped shaking their tails, Richard let go of his arm, and he fired again at the next creature. He repeated the process to quickly eliminate the last of the creatures before daring to speak. What were those things? He watched as Richard walked to the far wall, tapping each of the kegs in the wine cellar. Trappers. They are blind but have excellent hearing. Their only attack is the suicide attack that transports the target to another dimension. I don't think you want to experience it there, even though one can escape it. Richard then tapped on the far walls, searching for something. Peter took in the information and thought about the other stranger creatures that they saw. What about the other creatures? Those things that attacked the nurse or sister? Richard tapped the far wall before answering his question. Those were bone thieves. Nasty creatures, and from what I can tell, they have very strong legs. That's why we should be invisible until we find you a hand weapon. The guns will be good, but the best way to handle those things is a sword, or any close weapon. As long as they can't see you, or you keep moving, they can't pounce on you. If they do manage to do that, you want to shake them off before they can bore into you. Peter shuddered as Richard walked back towards him. He wondered how many of the nurses met that awful fate before he arrived. He then wondered if he would have had the same fate happen to him had he not discovered the letter. He stopped thinking about it when he saw Richard trip over something and almost fall. He glanced down, since his eyes were adjusted to the darkness, and saw a soldier's body. He glanced up at Richard and said, "Could the trappers do this to a soldier?" He saw Richard shake his head. "No, but until we get some light on, we can't make any judgments. The only thing we can be sure of is that he's definitely dead." He didn't want to ask how Richard was sure of that, but he could see that the man was certain of it. He then watched as Richard looked at the door that was to the right when they entered the room. "You know, this door and the one across from it were not here in the past. Let's check them out." Peter nodded in agreement, and then carefully opened the door. Both their eyes were now used to the darkness, and Peter could see the huge boiler against the wall. He watched as Richard walked over to it and listened for a moment. Peter walked next to him and listened as well before he realized what he was hearing. "There's no steam going through the pipes." He watched as Richard looked at him, almost amazed. "I was wondering what seemed wrong. Our home back in England hadn't used a boiler like this in years." Peter started to wonder what the other man's home did use, since most big buildings now needed a boiler to handle most things. Peter moved forward to a huge wheel on the boiler and turned it. Soon the sound of steam could be heard going through all the pipes. He turned and saw a door almost opposite the door they had entered from. He wondered why neither of them had noticed it at first, but given that in the dark they couldn't always see all the room's features at once. He quickly walked over to the door and tried to open it. It wouldn't open outwards, but when he pushed it inwards, something was in the way. He looked at Richard and shook his head. If there is something in that room, I don't think we can get at it." He was stunned when Richard calmly walked over to the wall and then knelt down and apparently put his hand into the wall. It was then that Peter noticed the hole in the base of the wall. He then saw Richard start to mutter something, and soon he was surrounded by 3 glowing figures. When the figures faded, Peter saw a trapper, and in front of Richard's face was an image of everything in front of the trapper. He was about ready to panic when Richard finally spoke. "It's one of the spells in the tome. I can send the trapper in, and then have it remove whatever might be blocking the door." Peter was a bit worried, but decided to wait and see what happened. He watched as the creature entered the hole in the wall, and he then saw the next room. It appeared to be full of coal and a few crates. It was then he saw it. Resting right by the door was a dead soldier. If the soldier had been alive, he would have reacted to the sight of the creature. Soon he saw the soldier glowing, and the image disappeared. He looked at Richard and saw him walk to the door and open it. "I had the trapper get rid of the dead soldier. It also killed the trapper, so we won't have to deal with it." He could tell he still had the worried look on his face, and Richard put a hand on his shoulder. "I know it sounds surreal, and after seeing them you probably doubt me. Just remember that I helped you get past the bone thieves, and I will help you when we come across other threats." Peter thought about the man's words for a moment. The man had been helpful, and apparently through this strangeness before. However, the man had brought one of the things that they were fighting. He weighed things over in his mind, and given everything that was happening, he made his choice. "I believe you. I admit that the trapper spooked me, but you could have left me to those things. My only defense would have been my camera flash, and that takes time to prepare." He saw Richard nod in response. They then entered the coal-filled room. Peter figured that it was the source of the boiler's fuel. He then noticed a gold circular object on top of one of the crates. He picked it up and noticed that on it was a shape with 7 sides. After he looked at it for a moment, he was stunned when it disappeared in a golden flash. He turned to Richard and looked down at his empty hands. "You won't believe what I had found. It was a golden disc that just disappeared. He watched as Richard pointed to the tome. It's a circle of power. It can be used to create more powerful versions of the spells we have now in there. I can set those up if you want. Peter thought about it for a moment before finally answering. Tell me what I have to do, and I'll set them up as we head back to the room on the other side of the wine cellar. He saw Richard nod, and then heard him detail what had to be done. Mainly, it was the addition of 2 Paragon runes to the existing 5 rune spells. As he set up the spells, he followed Richard from the coal room, through the boiler room, back into the wine cellar, and finally through the door. When they entered the room, he noticed a large generator with a lever in front of it. He also heard the hiss of steam in the pipes. He looked over at the wall and noticed a fuse box on the wall. He walked over to it and opened it. He also heard Richard pull the lever, only to be rewarded with silence and darkness. Peter opened the fuse box and looked for a moment. Even though it would have been easier to see if he had a light of some sort, he could already see what the problem was. It's not going to start until we replace the fuse. He glanced back at Richard, who was standing near the lever. You wouldn't happen to have one on you? Richard just shook his head. The thought never crossed my mind. However, most times there was always something around to provide light, like a torch. Hopefully we will find one soon, because we are going to need it. Peter reached into his pocket and pulled out a penny. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it was his lucky penny. It also looked to fill the place of the burnt fuse. He put it in and turned towards Richard. Pull the lever now. He watched as Richard pulled the lever, and soon the place lit up. He had to blink for a few times before his eyes adjusted to the new light in the place. After looking in only the darkness for so long, it was good to have some light. He saw things a bit clearer now. He could see that the generator was relatively new, as well as the box of rifle ammo across from the generator. When he had the ammo in hand, he turned to his slightly amazed companion. Shall we head back upstairs? He watched as Richard nodded. First, we should make sure we are invisible. You still don't have a good weapon for handling bone thieves. He then watched as the runes appeared around Richard. He immediately cast the same spell, and they ran out of the generator room. They quickly ran up the steps, and Peter was thankful that the lights were now on. The darkness that was caused by the night outside was banished. He could even see the stained glass windows of the altar area. He glanced back as Richard came up the steps, and then heard the sound of an incoming bomb. He stepped down the steps and motioned for Richard to stop. It was at the right moment as he heard the glass shatter with the explosion. When the tinkling of glass stopped, they both got out of the stairway and noticed that all the bone thieves were facing the altar. He watched as Richard motioned to the door where the soldier had been stationed earlier. There was one bone thief in the path, but he remembered that they couldn't be seen. They quickly ran past the bone thief. He noticed as they passed the thing that seemed to follow where they were. He wondered if the invisibility had worn off, but they reached the door and the creature didn't react. When they entered the old tower, Peter almost gasped out loud at the sight before them. A bone thief was pouncing onto a nurse. Apparently she wasn't one of the possessed, but she was soon going to be. For a moment he raised the rifle in hopes of just knocking the creature off the nurse so she could run. Before he could fire, Richard pushed the gun down and pointed toward the back of the tower. It was then he saw it, a second bone thief in the room, and if he fired the gun, he would have alerted it to their position. He then saw Richard motion to the stairs as they moved toward them and started up. He glanced back as they rushed up and saw the creature enter the nurse and felt bad that they couldn't save her. When they reached the top of the steps, he glanced back down to see if the now possessed nurse or the other bone thief was following them. He wasn't sure if the invisibility had worn off or not. He then stopped to catch his breath. He was surprised that Richard wasn't tired at all. Maybe something about the situation gave the man an extra burst of energy. He was almost startled when Richard finally spoke. "Peter, come over here." He walked over to the curved back wall of the tower, between two shelves, and saw what Richard had wanted him to see. It was an old sword, but it glistened as if no dust had ever been on it. That sword was once used by a page of Charlemagne, and later by a Franciscan monk, who also came across the evil here. It would be better to use on the bone thieves, and most any creature that will be walking around here. Peter carefully took the sword, and he could swear he felt a power course through him. He also saw more ammo for the revolver he had found. He picked it up and then headed for the steps. Before he started down, he turned toward Richard, who hadn't moved. He could tell something was bothering the man. "Is there something I'm missing?" Richard shook his head and then spoke. "No, but you should be a bit more prepared. There's a shield spell and an enchant item spell. Cast them now, both using the Mantaraka purple rune." He did as Richard suggested, and was amazed that the sword now had a purple glow, and that several small orbs were orbiting him. He then saw Richard do the same thing, and watched as the man ran down the steps. He quickly followed, and hoped they were ready for this. Richard Cale ran down the steps, sword in hand, and knew what had to be done. He knew Peter was behind him, and he yelled back, "Go for the lone one. The shield will protect you. I'll handle the one in the sister." When he reached the bottom of the steps, he saw both the nurse and the bone thief look at him. 2 orbs from his shield flew out and struck the two. He watched as Peter ran towards the lone bone thief, and he swung his sword at the nurse. "I'd say sorry, sister, but I know it's too late for you." He swung his sword, and the enchantment he put on it allowed it to go through the possessed sister's neck. Soon the bone thief burst out, and he followed up by lopping off the creature's blade arms. Soon both creatures were dead, and Richard looked up to see Peter heading to the main cathedral door. "Let's take out the others. I'm sure those things have killed the other sisters here." He then saw Peter open the door and rush out. He wasn't sure how old Peter was, but it had to be younger than he was. He quickly followed Peter, briefly glancing back at the door which had led to the office of the bishop in Charlemagne's time, knowing something lurked in that room. When he entered the main cathedral, he saw Peter taking on another bone thief, and another was coming up on him. Richard reacted and attacked the creature. After the two bone thieves were dead, he glanced towards the annex. He was surprised to see a bone thief coming from there. He wondered if the creatures knew how to open doors, but that was a question he didn't want to focus on now. He started to run toward the creature just as the thing jumped into the air. He knew it was aiming for him, and that he couldn't turn around before it struck. What did happen was luck. Richard let his body go into a slide, and he started to slide like the American baseball players did when sliding into a base. He was thankful for his trousers being so long as he slid. It minimized any scrapes from the stone floor. As he slid, he saw the creature soar over him and land a few inches from where he had been. The creature turned around to go after him, but not before Peter came at it from behind. That quickly, Peter had killed the creature. Another creature down. There might be another on the balcony. Richard got up off the floor just as Peter ran through the doors to the annex. He glanced back toward the old tower, knowing that something important was in the unexplored room. He then ran after Peter, entering the annex just in time to see Peter running up to the balcony. He also noticed that Peter's shield was almost out of orbs to protect him. He quickly ran up, catching up to Peter just before the man opened the door. Peter, before you open that door, restore your shield. Peter glanced at him and then paused for a moment. You're right. I guess I got caught up in the moment. It's a bit satisfying to get rid of those creatures. As Peter restored his shield, Richard did the same. Those creatures have an effect on one's sanity. Destroying them actually restores that lost sanity. He then watched as Peter opened the door, and they both headed through. Their appearance had surprised the bone thief that had been lurking on the balcony. Each of them swung at the creature, each taking out one of the blade arms, which killed the creature. With the last creature dead, they headed back down to the main cathedral and the sanctuary. As they walked, Richard was still stunned at how gung-ho Peter had seemed. What caused that change in you? You seemed meek before getting the sword. As they approached the altar, Peter answered his question. I think it was a combination of things. I felt this power coursing through me when I picked up this sword. You know, it feels like I have to hold this thing with both hands. But I could carry it with one. However, I also thought of how many wounded soldiers and the sisters died because of those things. Richard understood what Peter was saying. Ever since he and Yvette had met Alexander Roivas, they had seen their own fair share of the death the ancients had caused. Too many have died because of them. King Charlemagne was killed for the evil that is here. Those things possessed monks and lured in innocents. You don't want to know the full extent of those that fell victim to them. Richard thought about it for a moment and wondered if people in his own life had been at risk, and if it included the losses in his own life. When he drove those thoughts from his mind, he noticed that Peter was heading towards the organ. Inside, he inwardly cursed that they had not gone back to the old tower. He felt something was being left behind in the old tower. As he approached, he saw Peter pick up what looked like an old sheet. Instantly he remembered it and wondered how it was still on the organ. When he neared, he heard Peter remark, "This looks like sheet music, but I can't tell what notes are on it." Richard motioned over to the other side of the altar area, towards a closed cabinet. "Get over there and be ready. Playing that music will open the cabinet up." Richard then looked at the sheet music and saw that Peter was right. The notes could barely be read. However, those notes seemed ingrained in his head. He let his fingers dance over the keyboard, playing the haunting melody. After he played it, the organ played it again, and the cabinet on the far side opened. He turned around as Peter pulled out something. "It looks like a door handle, but all the doors we've seen we've opened. Where could this handle go?" Richard shook his head after he heard Peter's statement. "We haven't opened every door we've seen. There is the room in the old tower that used to be the bishop's office, for lack of a better word." He then led the way back into the old tower. As they entered the old tower, they headed for the door under the steps. Richard started to remember what had happened in that room in the past. Charlemagne's death, as well as Anthony's death. Death always seemed to play a part in that room's history, and Richard didn't know how bad it would be this time. He was broke out of his thoughts when Peter said, "The handle doesn't go with that door. There is a doorknob on it." He then watched as Peter opened the door, and they stepped inside. The room had only one light in it, a torch that was on the far wall. However, in the torchlight, Richard saw the three corpses moving towards them. He also realized Peter noticed it as well. They both went after the animated corpses and cut them to pieces before any of them could harm them. When the corpses were nothing more than pieces, Peter spoke again. "Not much in here, other than body bags and some ammo." Richard walked over to the far wall and grabbed the torch. "And the torch. Believe me, this will come in handy." He knew Peter might doubt him, especially that electricity was now in the building. But when Peter spoke, it was out of other concerns. "That means one of us won't be able to fight. We can't put an open flame down." Richard let go of the torch, and the second it started to fall, the flame went out. When it hit the floor, it was out. But the second Richard grabbed it, it lit up again. He could see a stunned expression on Peter's face. "It's magical. Do you think it can help us find the door the handle goes to?" Richard shook his head and then headed towards the door. There is a marking on the wall opposite the tower door. In the past, that wall had a door. I'm betting the marking signifies the door is invisible, and only we seem to be able to see the mark. As they passed through the old tower, he heard Peter gasp, "You saw those marks as well? I thought that was something one of the soldiers did. How could you tell it wasn't?" As they entered the cathedral, Richard led the way to the markings. Thanks to the tome's magic, I've seen it multiple times. Since we can see it, we must be the ones who can discover what it hides. He glanced back to see Peter nodding. He had to wonder what was going through Peter's mind. It had to be mind-boggling to deal with the threat of the ancients during World War I. When they finally reached the wall, he paused for a moment. The symbol in the center was the one standing for Chturga, and it blazed red, framed by the same circle they had just found. It would take a very powerful spell to reveal the door the spell was obviously hiding. He realized there was only one spell to use, and just one way to cast it to reveal the door. He looked over at Peter and pointed at the book. Cast the Reveal Invisible spell, using the blue rune, the one for Ulioth. He stood back as Peter looked over the spells and finally reached the spell in question. He knew the only time the young man had cast the spell, it was to become invisible. Soon he saw the runes of the spell circling the two of them, and then a blue haze entered his view, exposing the missing door. Before he could say anything to Peter, the young man rushed forward and placed the missing handle in the door and opened it. You were right. That spell and markings were hiding the door. He followed Peter into the room, the now open door, and the hidden cloakroom. Richard was glad that there were no creatures in the room. Something in him told him that more dangerous creatures lurked in the catacombs below. A quick glance around told him the only important thing in the room were boxes of ammo. He also noticed that Peter was already grabbing the ammo. I have a feeling he'll be needing that soon. When Peter was done grabbing the ammo, Richard saw the young man turn to him. You honestly think we might need to use the guns? We haven't used them much so far. Richard thought about it for a moment. So far, the only creatures that needed to be shot were trappers. The zombies and bone thieves were easy to get rid of using a sword. Even the horrors, which they hadn't seen yet, could be taken care of with a sword. But there was the possibility of the lesser guardians and the gatekeepers. Those two creatures would be easier to defeat with a rifle. It's very likely some of the creatures I've encountered are powerful. When Peter had grabbed the last box of ammo, Richard looked down at the floor that led to a ladder. He gasped when he realized it was blood. He wondered if it belonged to some of the departed soldiers, or maybe of some of the nurses. Whomever the blood had belonged to, he realized that the person had met with a gruesome fate. He then walked over to the ladder and started to climb down. He knew he was taking a big risk, but he remembered Pius's words from a previous encounter. Pius had stated that he had avoided death in their encounters 10 times, and this time was definitely prior to Edwin's time. When he had reached the bottom of the ladder, he turned and looked down the hall with torch in hand. The hallway was clear. It's all clear down here, Peter. He stepped away from the ladder and walked down the hall. He stopped when he reached a door and listened. He was hoping to just hear some movement, but wasn't surprised when he heard some hisses. He turned just in time to see Peter nearing him. He held up his hand and then said, "Enchant your weapons, use a shield spell, and then turn invisible." He was glad when Peter only nodded and then cast the spells. He did the same, and they quickly entered the room. Part of him wasn't surprised to see 4 zombies, each turning towards the door they had come through. Their shields did not leave them, but Richard was glad they were ready. Both of their swords were glowing purple, and the enchanted blades quickly went through the necks of the walking corpses. Within seconds, 2 of the corpses collapsed, and the other 2 exploded, revealing bone thieves. They then quickly destroyed the creatures before the fiends ever knew they were in the room. When the last creature fell, Richard motioned to the other door in the room, and they both passed through it. He was thankful that it led to a circular stairwell. It seemed devoid of creatures, but Richard was already aware that wasn't always the case. He slowly made his way down, holding the torch in front of them, until he finally saw the lower door. He listened again to the door, and this time he heard the roar of a horror. He waited for a moment, and heard what sounded like a fight. He turned towards Peter again, and quietly said, "We go in, but don't do anything until I motion." He was thankful when Peter nodded in understanding, and they entered. When they closed the door, Richard realized what he heard. He had seen it back in the Forbidden City. It was a battle between a horror and a bunch of zombies. Both were opposing alignments. Part of him wanted to lunge forward while they were invisible, but he knew that wasn't the best course. If they attacked now, the horror's attacks would include them as targets. Plus, they still had the element of surprise to work with. Soon the battle ended, and only the creature of the superior alignment remained. It was then the 2 attacked and quickly destroyed the victor of the battle. When the creature's body disappeared, Richard looked up and saw the door that led to the binding hall. It was the place where Paul Luther met his gruesome fate, and Richard knew they needed to go there. If they were lucky, the creature wouldn't be waiting for them. He quickly ran to the door and tried to open it. He wasn't surprised to find the door locked. He sighed and stepped back. "I should have known the door would be locked. We need to get down there." He turned when he heard another door open. It had been directly opposite from the binding hall door, and his memory told him it led to the dark altar the Bishop of Anthony's time had used. Peter was cautiously opening the door. "Well, maybe the key is down this hall." He followed Peter into the hallway, holding the torch up. The second the door was closed, he heard the telltale sound of trappers. He also noticed that Peter had already pulled out the revolver and shot at the trappers. When the last one fell, they quickly moved through the hall and entered the arcane library. He watched as Peter moved towards a chair holding a letter, and Richard also noticed something else in the room. He quickly moved forward and attacked the lurking bone thief. Almost instantly, he destroyed the deadly foe. When he was done, he heard Peter exclaim, "That soldier had realized what was going on. The sisters, or what was passing for the sisters, were bringing the wounded down here. But what exactly were they being brought down here for?" "Food. The wounded were being brought down here for the creature down that locked hallway." He saw a horrified look cross Peter's face. He went to the back hallway and cautiously looked down it. Pius Augustus summoned some sort of unholy creature to guard something. I can only guess on what it is guarding, but part of me is hoping the thing might be resting when we get down there. With luck, we can just sneak in and out before it awakens. As they entered the hall, they heard more movement. It was the squishing sound of a trapper's feet. They slowly moved forward and froze when the trapper stepped into view. Richard silently motioned, and Peter took aim with his gun. There was a loud bang, and the trapper gave a death squeak as it collapsed. They waited for a moment to be sure another one wasn't moving about, and then moved around the corner towards the door at the end of the hall. They quickly entered the secret altar, and Richard was not surprised to see another trapper and a zombie in a small room. He motioned in the direction of the trapper, and Peter fired his gun. As the trapper died, Richard swung the torch he had right at the zombie. He watched as the creature backed away for a moment. He thought about it quickly. The zombie was an animated corpse, and possibly easily destroyed by fire. He went to swing the torch again, but another gunshot resounded in the small room. Peter had used the rifle, and in the small room the bang was deafening. It had been accompanied by the head of the zombie exploding. He turned to face Peter and saw the young man's mouth moving. He couldn't hear what Peter was saying, but from the actions it had to be an apology. Soon the ringing stopped, and he finally heard Peter, "I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize the sound would be amplified in here. I just figured the rifle would be faster to be rid of the zombie." He politely smiled, even though he was still upset. "No problem. Maybe we shouldn't worry about using that rifle until we get into a room with a lot of open area." He then glanced over at the small altar to Chitarga. "At least we found something important here." He walked over to the altar and picked up an odd-looking key. "This is the key to the binding hall. We will have to be careful down there." They started back towards where the horror and the zombies were fighting. As they passed through the rooms, he heard Peter ask, "Do you think any of the weapons we have will be useful down there?" As they re-entered the room where the binding hall door was, Richard paused. Part of it was because of the question. If the creature was still down there, none of the guns Peter had would make a dent in it. Even if they were enchanted, they might not have an effect. The second reason he paused was that this time he noticed a familiar door in the room. It was the door that led to the chasm, where Paul Luther had found the dead custodian. Richard moved towards the door and finally answered the question. "I don't know, but maybe we should check in here. There may be something in here that will help." They quietly entered the room, and Richard remembered what had been found in the room last time. Like then, the chasm and the altar above it still remained. However, Richard could not see a body on it. What he did hear was the sound of trappers. In a moment he saw 3 walking in their direction. He glanced over at Peter and watched as he raised the small gun. Soon a gunshot echoed in the large room, and 1 trapper fell. Almost instantly, the others seemed to spin in their direction. They knew where the sound had come from, but he was hoping Peter would wait before firing the next shot. When their squealing stopped, Richard heard Peter fire the gun again. And like the previous shot, it hit its mark. After the lone trapper squealed its head off, Peter fired 1 last time, and the last one fell. Once it was gone, they started towards the altar. Deep down, Richard dreaded what they might find. Images of the custodian's corpse came to his mind, and he started to fear that one of the missing soldiers would be on the altar, with his heart carved out of him. He was almost startled when Peter broke the silence. "It looks like a blue bottle of some sort is on it." Richard glanced at the altar and saw what Peter meant. Sitting on top of the altar was a blue bottle. He wasn't exactly sure what it was, but something told him it was important. They approached the altar, and Richard started to think things through. Anything red was normally linked to strength and body. The zombies that were red in color had shown some regenerative qualities. Green seemed to be linked to sanity, whose example was in the odd green bone thieves, which had no heads. He thought then of the color blue, and how anything blue seemed to exhibit some magical qualities. The blue zombies seemed to have some sort of link and started to glow when they sang. However, he never did find out what that glow meant. It may be some potion to restore magical powers. He then watched as Peter grabbed the bottle, and that fast his vision blurred. He started to stagger as he saw images of Paul Luther. In the first was the gruesome death by 1 claw of the creature. Then he saw an image of Paul Luther being squashed by one of a different creature's 3 legs. Another moment, Paul Luther was struck by green lightning. Soon he started to black out as the image started to change again. Before he fully went unconscious, he wondered how weird this blink attack felt. Peter Jacob turned just in time to see the man who had been with him since the weirdness started beginning to collapse. He quickly ran over and grabbed the man. If Richard had continued to fall like he was, he would have fallen into the chasm. After a few moments, Richard started to open his eyes. He was stunned when the first words out of the man's mouth was, "What color was that symbol we saw earlier?" Peter shook his head, unsure of why the question was asked, and said, "Why does that matter? You almost fell into the chasm." As Richard started to steady himself, he spoke, "It matters a lot, and it's very hard to explain, but what happened was a bit disorienting. Just answer the question for me." He didn't understand why this was so important, but Peter finally answered the question. "The mark on the wall had been red. Is that information really that important?" He watched as Richard nodded, and then started towards the door to the room. "Very important. If that beast is in the binding hall, we know which rune to use with any of the spells to get past it." Peter followed Richard as they left the chasm room and headed straight for the locked door. When Richard stopped at it, Peter remembered he had the key to unlock it. He started to unlock the door. "So, do you think we have any spells to help us get past this thing, if it's still there?" He wasn't comforted when Richard just shrugged. He then opened the door and they entered it. Thanks to the torch that Richard was holding, he saw what awaited them. There were more walking corpses in the narrow hallway. The narrow hallway would not allow them to swing their swords, but he saw Richard trying to hold them back by swinging the torch. Peter moved forward and swung the sword in a vertical motion. With each corpse that got hit, it was cut in two. Slowly they made their way through the hall, destroying the walking corpses. Eventually, the last of the animated corpses fell, and no more blocked their way. When they went through the door, they started down another circular stairwell. Peter was stunned that there were soldiers' corpses along the way. He was stunned when he noticed strange marks on each of them, and even noticed that some seemed to be missing parts. He glanced back at Richard, who looked at the corpses and only shuddered once. What could have done this? Richard continued down, stopping to illuminate one with the torch. Most likely the beast that's in the binding hall. I just hope it had enough to rest for a while. He then watched as Richard continued down. Inwardly, Peter was scared at what Richard's words meant. He looked at the rifle he had and started to doubt that it would be effective anymore. When they reached the bottom, he noticed a door, but his attention was drawn more to a scroll that hung on the wall. Some of the markings on it looked like runes that were in the tome. He quickly picked up the scroll and was stunned that the description was in English. Soon he saw the spell would launch several lightning bolts at his enemies. He was stunned when it disappeared in a flash of yellow. "Richard, I think I found something that might help. A spell called Magical Attack." He watched as Richard came over to him and then looked at the tome. A smile crossed the other man's face. "I think you're right. All we need to do is use the rune of Ulioth, the blue rune." Peter looked at the book again and saw the rune Richard was talking about. He then closed the book and headed through the door. They slowly continued through the hall, taking one right-hand turn before finally stopping at a final door with a huge black circle on it. Peter hesitated before opening the door. "Do you think we're ready for this?" He watched as Richard nodded, and then he opened the door. When they entered the large room, Peter noticed a few things. First was a huge pit at the far end of the room. The second was the eerie illumination the room gave. Third were the walls of the room. Each wall depicted a skeletal image committing various acts of evil. Some of the images seemed to hint that the being killed other people directly or indirectly. It made the whole room a very unsettling sight. As they reached the pit, they both paused as a huge rumbling sound echoed through the room. That quickly he could see fear on Richard's face. That meant the beast was awake. Soon enough, a huge creature with crab-like claws and an odd-shaped mouth came out of the pit. As they both stared, a monstrous voice echoed throughout the room. "Is this the one who dares challenge me?" As the last word faded, 4 red orbs flew to the far end of the hall, creating a lightning barrier between them. Peter glanced back at the barrier and felt a bit of despair. Any hopes they had of escaping was gone. His attention was brought back to the situation when Richard yelled, "Look out!" He turned back just in time to see the creature launch 2 red orbs from each claw. He did just like Richard had done and ran for the wall. Each of them had narrowly missed them, and Peter waited to see if more were coming. He flattened himself against the wall more when the creature shot out of its mouth a huge tongue. Something reminded him of a frog when that happened, but when it retracted, the creature appeared to be resting. In that moment, Richard ran across the hall to his side. "Use that spell you just found now while the thing is resting." Peter had forgotten about the spell when he first saw the creature. Now that he remembered having it, he quickly cast it, while the resting creature glowed with a reddish glow. The second the blue lightning hit it, the creature roared in pain and resumed its attack. This time they knew what to do to avoid the dangerous balls of energy and the creature's tongue. Soon the creature rested again, and Peter repeated the attack. It wasn't until after his third attack did something unusual happen. The barrier that had been blocking their only way out started to move forward. When it finally stopped, more corpses came out of the glowing runes that appeared in front of the creature. He cast the spell again, but was stunned when the attack only destroyed the corpses. Why didn't it work this time? He watched as Richard pulled out his sword and prepared to slice through any more corpses that would appear. Maybe it's because you used a low-level attack. Only 3 runes made up the spell. Try it with 5 runes. He went to do so as more corpses started to rise. However, this time the runes just fizzled out before he could even ask. He heard Richard say, "Drink some of that bile you found." He did so, and felt as if he could cast any spell. The potion was just what Richard thought it was. He then cast the spell again, just as the last corpse rose up. The big creature was glowing again and roared in pain as the corpses fell. In that moment, it glowed blue in color. The creature tried to retaliate, but they stayed on the move. Soon the huge creature summoned another wave of corpses, which meant it would be weak for a moment. With 2 more attacks after that, the creature moved the barrier again. Peter was amazed that the creature brought them so close to it. If it wanted to, it could have gulped them down right there. However, before he could even ask Richard what might happen, the creature raised its claws, and Peter realized what was happening. "It's going to try and smash us!" He quickly ran out of the way as a claw came down where he had been standing. He glanced over in Richard's direction and saw the man running from where the other claw hit. He then saw the claw coming down on his location and kept moving. He kept running in the smaller area and lost track of where Richard was. Soon the creature rested and glowed its weak state glow. He didn't want to risk a more powerful version of the attack spell and used the one he first used. Soon the creature roared in pain, but he noticed the blue glow was more intense, and the creature finally collapsed into the pit it had been spawned from. He then noticed at the other side of the pit was Richard, and the fading blue runes around him. The moment of victory was soon shattered by the sound of shattering glass. They both looked at a wall behind the pit, and Peter saw something floating behind where a stained glass window used to be. The barriers the creature had created were also gone. They both moved toward the thing, and Peter noticed it was ghostly blue. He turned towards Richard as they neared it. "What is it?" Richard glanced ahead and finally spoke. It's an evil artifact that represents Ulioth, a creature that is very intelligent, intellect and magic oriented. I think the creature we just fought was oriented with Shaturga. Peter glanced at it and then tried to reach for it. Before he could touch it, Richard grabbed his arm. Don't touch it with your hands. Wrap it with some cloth or part of your shirt. Then get it out of here and out of this area of the world. Eventually, find Edward Roivas and give it to him. Peter looked at him and took his words to heart. He removed his outer vest and wrapped the object in it. He then headed out, ready to leave the evil place. He glanced back into the hall as he reached the door and saw Richard slowly moving around the pit. It was as if he saw something still over the pit. He didn't want to rush out, but he felt he had to. The item he now had needed to be gotten away from here. He rushed out and hoped his ally would be all right. Richard glanced back at the pit as he headed out, confident that Peter would be all right. As he walked around the pit, he started to have the various visions again. He felt dizzy all of a sudden. He saw him and Peter defeating a stick figure-like creature, and then a tripod-like creature. Soon he staggered back and leaned against the wall, waiting for the feeling to pass. By the time the blink feeling passed, he heard someone in the hall. His first thought was it was Peter, but he gasped when he walked into the view of Pius Augustus entering the binding hall.
So it's you again. How did you manage to defeat the Guardian?
Before he could respond, Pius continued to speak.
It's no matter. There is no way you can leave here with the veil of Ulioth. Our 8th encounter will be our last. Prepare to enter oblivion.
Richard tried to back up, but he realized he was at the pit's edge. He glanced back, and then at Pius, who was about to cast a spell with his staff. It was at that moment that he saw the whole scene melting away, being replaced by that of the Roivas estate. He smiled and laughed. Not this time, Pius. Besides, I don't have the veil. Another person has it. As the scene dissolved more, he heard Pius bellow in defeat. But he did feel the pain of the lightning attack. Even though it had been weakened by the return, it still hurt him. He could feel the pain rippling through his body as the weakened red lightning circled his body. He just hoped he had time to recover from the slightly draining blow before they found the next chapter.